You wrote a book about your own experiences. Was that a cathartic experience?
You know, that's my least favorite question. No.
Well, excuse me.
No, it's all right.
No one told me that.
I'll answer. No, it's my least favorite question only because somehow I can't explain why not. It was not a cathartic experience at all. It was really awful. I was not at that point, and I think I best just be honest about this. I wrote the book when I was 21 years old. I'm 27, and that's not a vast amount of time, but it's a significant period of a life. You know, you go from being just barely past your teens to nearly 30. And so there's a huge difference in perspective that has happened for me even in the last year. And so writing that book when I was 21, I think gave it an immediacy that I like, but there's a lot of anger to it. And I still was much more in the disorder than I am now, even though I was doing very well at the time. It wasn't cathartic. It led me also right back into the behaviors. I was too close to it, and I'm glad I wrote it. I think it had an important impact, but I'm really glad not to feel any need to write anything like it ever again.
Annie, did you read her book?
Yes, I did. I have read it many, many times.
What did you
It's
think?
dog-eared, and there's a lot of underlined passages.
The title, Wasted, was that what you were like?
No, I never got to that point.
You never got totally emaciated or anything?
Which means that a lot of people would look at me and say that I don't look like I have an eating disorder, and I never did.
That was my first reaction when I watched the documentary, and I said,
It's like, oh, she looks so healthy, and, you know, blah, 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 and therefore it must not be a very serious eating disorder because, you know, I didn't get like those really stick-thin people, so I don't really count as having an eating disorder. And a lot of people have that reaction.
And that's something that maybe people need to understand.
Yeah.
You may not necessarily
I think that most
like
people with
the
eating
case.
disorders look more like me than 50, 60
I would agree
pounds.
with her 100%. I mean, I think very rarely can you see an eating disorder. I mean, it's very rare.
And if you're looking for 50-pound people, you're going to miss everything, and it.
We'll get into this a little bit more because you two became the masters of manipulation and secrecy, which is something that happens very much. Also joining us for this conversation about eating disorders and the family are Dr. Pat Fallon, a psychologist and researcher who's been treating eating disorders here in Seattle for 20 years. Dr. Fallon is on the clinical faculty at the University of Washington, and she's also president-elect of the Academy of Eating Disorders. Virginia Lowe is co-founder and coordinator of a parent support group called Friends and Family Northwest. Her daughter suffered from an eating disorder, and as I understand it, Virginia, she's recovered now?
Right.
So you must be happy in that sense. Well, let me ask you, Dr. Fallon, and I won't call you Dr. Pat because I know you don't like that, and I don't want to have any trouble here. Okay. Well, Pat, what they just said, the fact that, what Annie just said, the fact that you know, there may be this image of what someone looks like with an eating disorder, and the fact that, you know, there are young women that do get totally emaciated. Even within the documentary Perfect Illusions, the young woman who committed suicide, Anna, did get to that point, and her best friend, you know, talked about how it was so shocking to see her that way. But elaborate a little bit more on what Annie said. I mean, the person that might have a eating disorder, is there a typical profile?
Well, I think one of the things about eating disorders is that there's such a range and a variety of both behaviors and the kind of women and men as well that can have eating disorders. And when we talk about women,
Because it's not just
it's not just women.
But it's mainly women.
90 to 95% are women, but there are also men that develop eating disorders. But I do think that this belief that we have that we can somehow see, if we look at somebody and we look hard enough, we'll be able to see that they have an eating disorder, is one of the things that probably means that parents oftentimes don't see what they need to be seen with their kids. And sometimes you need to go beneath just what somebody looks like and think about what are the sorts of feelings they're projecting, what kind of behaviors do they have, and look at a bigger picture of things. But no, I mean, there aren't many 60-pound people walking around anyway that are over the age of 10. And, and if they've gotten to that point, they have needed to be in the hospital, and people have easily been able to identify them. So, you know, there's a whole range. People can have bulimia that are overweight and are heavy. They can be normal sized, and with anorexia, sometimes it's a very quick descent into low weight, but sometimes it's slow. And
Briefly, give me a description, the differences, anorexia, bulimia. I think we've heard those terms a lot when we talk about eating disorders, but what is each one? What are the differences? And are they tied together at all?
Tied together, I'll come back to the tied together piece of it, but bulimia is basically a disorder in which people eat what they feel like is too much. Now, by some people's definition, it may be too much. Other people's, it may not be, but they eat what they feel like is too much, and then they make themselves throw up, or they compulsively exercise in order to get rid of those calories.
But is it like a binge eating?
It's a binge eating, but for some people, a binge may be eating a whole sandwich instead of a half a sandwich, or eating some chips with their whole sandwich. It depends some, and for some people, it's. I mean, a lot of times on the media, you'll see it described as eating huge quantities of food, and while that's true for some people, that's not necessarily the experience of all people when they're binging.
Is it
and anorexia is characterized by really a enormous restriction in terms of what they eat, and a steadfast statement about their feeling or being fat, even though you could line up a whole bunch of people that would say, no, you're not, which often happens for anorexics. Everybody's trying to convince them that they're not really.
Virginia Lowe, your daughter, in her situation, I mean, both Annie and Maria have talked about gave us hints about the secrecy and, people not knowing, and their own family not knowing. How old was your daughter when you found this out?
It was the very beginning of her senior year, but I started suspecting it during the junior year, kind of along second semester.
So she might have been 16, 17,
right? Right.
Okay. And
I knew something wasn't right, but I honestly did not know what it was. It was one of her sisters that took me out and said, "Mom, I want to tell you what's the matter."
What was she doing?
She was getting compulsive about everything. Like, I remember when she had to give a talk for her English class, and she must have practiced it 30 times. And I knew that she knew it. And I said, what's going on? Why are you overdoing this so much? She started withdrawing from the family. She started hiding. Her eating habits started getting what families come in and say are weird and strange, which means that they don't like to eat with you anymore. They start eating different foods than they ever ate before, or they start cooking for the family a lot and want you to eat it, but they don't want to eat it. But mostly I would say with her, withdrawal, extreme withdrawal, fatigue. You could just see stress in her body.
Was she anorexic, bulimic?
She was
both?
anorexic, and so she got very, very thin eventually.
And
so it was evident after a couple of months.
At what point then did you finally get the clue? Because sometimes parents don't get the clue at all.
Well, we got the clue within the family because the family dynamic started getting rocky too, because we just couldn't figure out why the communication was different. But I think we
Between
really
mom
knew
and daughter, or just mom
between
and everybody else?
Mom and daughter and sisters. I mean, it just wasn't right. She just wasn't her happy. We always used to call her a ping pong child, and she just was she was always the connector in the family, and that wasn't going on anymore. I think we really realized that summer when she couldn't pull her body out of the water one day to go water skiing. And I just took her aside and I said, "Why do you think you can't do that anymore? What's going on with you?" And also, we noticed how extremely thin she was when we saw her in ski attire, water skiing attire.
Well, let's talk here about that your family's finding out now. And Annie, in your case, is revealed in the documentary. You hid this for 4 years from your parents, and they had no clue. Your mother was totally shocked, and it wasn't until a sorority sister told her? Mm-hmm. How did you manage to do that?
I don't know. I remember being surprised in the beginning how easy it was to hide it.
And when you were talking about hiding, what were you doing?
Pinpointed questions really don't get asked all that often, and so you don't ever have to flat out really lie about anything. It's always little things like, "Oh, I ate already," or I'm going somewhere else to have dinner. It's little like subversive sort of white lies, and that just becomes really easy to do. And if you have an understanding of how your parents process things, or how most people do, you not only cover up the little things, but you cover up more obscure kind of peripheral things that you think might lead them to the conclusion that you might have an eating disorder, and you can figure out what those are, and you can kind of spearhead other people from finding out.
Well, let's put it this way. You were a heck of a manipulator, weren't you? I mean, let's face it.
Yes, and
So, okay, were you hiding, were you anorexic and bulimic? Or?
yes, as both.
Okay.
And the documentary portrays me as being a bulimic, but through that whole time, I was also severely restrictive, and there were times when I was just plain anorexic, and I didn't eat, and I would lose weight, but I never got down to the point where it was noticeable because of that.
Mario, was your family? I mean, this, for you, you were, Annie, were what, 14?
When I started, yeah.
Okay, and you were younger.
I was 9. I think it's dangerous and perhaps unkind to families to suggest that there's some sort of Houdini-esque thing going on whereby people with eating disorders trick these oblivious, bumbling parents.
I'm not putting it that way. I'm saying that there was
I don't
secretive.
think you are. I think
I'm
it's
not
easy
saying it's
for.
secretive.
I think every parent looks at another parent who, say, misses a colossal eating disorder in their midst and says, "How could you do that? I would never miss that." But you would. I think most parents would, because like you say, you aren't asking that question. It's very rare that you will say to your 10 or 11 or 12-year-old, do you have bulimia? You know, I mean, you don't say that. You feel that something is wrong, but you don't know what it is. One of the most instructive things that my mom ever said to me about, how could you possibly not know? She said, you just keep stretching the boundaries of normal out further and further and further, and that's understandable, especially in a phase like adolescence. And then once somebody's out of the house, once you're an adult, hiding it becomes no longer an issue. So,
Pat Fallon, their behavior is very typical, it's very common.
I think those behaviors are really common, but again, there's sort of a spectrum. I think for some families find out very quickly, and in other families it can go on for a long time, and that can be because I like that idea of stretching the boundaries of what's normal. I mean, what's normal is what happens in your family, so it's not like you have something to compare it to. So in some families, I think it can go on for a very long time. In other families, it goes on not so.
Is this
very
okay?
quick.
One thing I want to know is this. It seems to me that there are a lot of factors in this, and it's not just one thing. I mean, oftentimes we hear these days it's the images that young women see, and obviously, I think they probably it plays some part into it. The fact that there's such a emphasis on being thin, or the images you see on the cover of a magazine, that type of thing. But there's so much more that goes into this. Is it genetic? Is it social behavior? Is it
That's what
depression?
researchers have been trying to answer that question for the last 20 years. I think that the best way that we can describe that is that there's a constellation of factors that come together, and when sort of the right building blocks come together, so to speak, then an eating disorder emerges from that. And those building blocks can be things like our culture, but we know every woman, or many women, see the images of thin women and glamorous women, and not all women that see those images develop eating disorders. They, in and of themselves, they don't do that. But we do know that Western cultures have higher rates of eating disorders. We know that families in which that don't communicate well can sometimes have difficulties be part of the eating disorder too. But there's lots of families that don't communicate very well, whose kids don't end up with an eating disorder. Genetics, I think, is one of the more newer and more interesting pieces of the puzzle when it comes to eating disorder, and it may be that certain things like that are genetically determined, such as temperament, obsessiveness, perfectionism, traits like that.
So you're
may
still
contribute
trying
to
to.
it.
I mean,
So
actually,
you're still trying to kind of. It doesn't mean that we don't know how to treat it. I think.
But
we have
really,
a
it's
pretty
only
good
been in the
idea
last 20 years that this is determining what anorexia and bulimia
Certainly
is,
determining
has
what
come
bulimia is.
about. Now, the two of you came from high-achieving families. I mean, your father's a lawyer, your mother has a couple of degrees, your parents very successful. What kind of impact did that have on this? Was there a sense of this perfection you needed to have, or did it play a role?
To speak for my own family, my parents never honestly pushed me. I mean, I saw friends whose parents literally pushed them to do certain things. I think it was the example of my parents that I myself, and this is my temperament and my character that I came with, felt inadequate, I needed to measure up. And that's, like you say, Pat, a constellation of my temperament and personality, the family that I grew up in, which was really all about success, and that was just a fact of the family, and the time that I grew up in. I was born in the 70s, and I grew up in the 80s, this sort of boom of needing to look, appear, acquire. I mean, I think the cultural dynamic does play a role in all of this as well, and I think it does not cause it, but it does play a role.
Annie?
Well, I would agree with Maria in that I don't remember being pushed horribly by my parents either. I remember wanting a lot of things and wanting to be a lot of things. And there might have been individual cases where, you know, my parents played a larger role, but they didn't make me into who I was. I mean,
What do you think made you fall into this?
oh God, I don't even know. I mean, it's just so
There's
many
a question
things.
for the
and-
ages, isn't it?
I know.
Yeah. Let me
And
move-
it's like,
go ahead.
if I had been a different person in my family, I might have turned out fine, and I might have not ever had depression or an eating disorder or anything. And had I been raised in a different family, I might have turned out okay too. It was just, it's a hook and an eye. You know, you can be who you are in a situation that's fine for you, or you can. It's just such a combination of things. I don't think you can talk to anyone with an eating disorder and they'll be
And
able
say
to
that
tell
it's
you
any one
exactly
thing.
what.
Virginia Lowe, talk about the family situation in this. You work with families. You created this organization with the emphasis on providing support, I take it.
For the family.
What do you see? The
Well, one thing I
impact
wanted
on
to say that I
families?
do see is that, and I can just start with my own family. I have 3 children very close together, and we have families that come to our support group Monday night after Monday night. And you can have a huge family, you can have a small family, and only one child usually gets sick with the eating disorder, and they were all within that family. And so what we tell families from our own experience, and this is from personal experience, I think everybody comes to an eating disorder with a little bit different recipe box of all these combinations that Pat talked with. And the important thing is everybody's going to get different get healthy in a different way. People come to our support group and they are hoping we're going to have that prescription, that they can go to the drugstore and they can buy that. And that's just not going to happen.
And in fact, that happened, and it was very evident in the documentary in your situation where you came back after being in treatment, and I think your mother expected things to be, you're going to be okay, but you weren't. And it was a shock, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Totally.
It takes a long time, and
And
it
it's-
takes some redefining of what you think about yourself, and it takes a few relapses so that you remember why you don't want to have an eating disorder, because it sucks. And it takes a long time. You're never going to emerge from anything fine.
It's a
Yeah.
process. It is a recovery, I think, for people is a process.
Let's talk, several things I want to talk about here in the short amount of time that we have left. This is very fascinating, and I think it's so important too. But treatment. In this state, there is no, as was mentioned in the documentary, the last treatment facility in the state, which was here in Seattle at Ballard Swedish, closed down. So there's no treatment facility here.
There's no inpatient treatment facility in the state of Washington.
So it means not everyone is going to need an inpatient treatment facility like both of you had. You know, in some cases, you can have success in individual treatment, right? Okay.
Yes.
But the cost, it seems like in Suni's case, her family, you know, what, $83,000? I mean, this was a huge amount of money. I think it could break a family, couldn't it?
Well, it certainly could. I mean, the cost of families, I think, can be excruciating. And I think it's one of the best arguments for having early detection. If you begin to be worried about your child, if anybody comes up to you and says, you know, their friends, their sorority sisters, whatever, comes up and say something, you really need to pay attention to that, because the longer it goes on, the more physically impaired somebody gets, the more intervention you're going to need. And I think there are no more inpatient treatment facilities here, but the idea is that people need access to good treatment. That could be individual treatment, group treatment, family treatment, more intensive outpatient treatment, and inpatient treatment.
And what about insurances? Do they cover this? Or is that a constant battle?
It's a constant battle. It depends on what the insurance companies are. Were you gonna say something?
When I was at my treatment program, the insurance company paid for it in the beginning, and they would approve one day at a time. And the lady in charge of that had to call them every single day for them to approve another day. I mean, as if something really significant was going to happen in one day. You know, I wasn't going to need to be there anymore. But they're very, very stingy usually with their allowing you to are paying for your treatment.
Which makes it very difficult to have any sort of reasonable treatment plan if you don't know if the person's going to be there the next day.
Virginia, and maybe Pat, you can also talk about this a little bit too. Let's talk about hope and success. What kind of success, what kind of hope is there?
I think our parent support group offers a lot of hope because we always have a group of parents whose children have recovered, and then we get a new group of people who come in totally anxious, full of anxiety, full of fear, full of misunderstandings about eating disorders. And then we have people that come in and stay for 2 or 3 years. They come faithfully every Monday night. And their daughters were very sick when they came, but they're finally starting to get to that recovery process. Pat very gently spoke about recovery as a process, and that's really our philosophy in the eating disorder support group for parents, is to help parents learn that it's not an event. It's not going to happen when Annie got out after how many weeks she was there, but it is a long process. And we try and really help parents have hope, number one, that their daughters will recover. And we try and offer them support to understand eating disorders, and we try and allow them to have a place where they can also vent. Parents get very angry about this disease. It makes them very, very angry. And so it's really nice to have a place that they can come that's safe for them also to vent that anger and then to start learning from one another from hearing other parents' stories.
Pat, what would you say about hope and success?
Oh, well, I would say the reason I like to work with eating disorders is because I believe people can get better from it. And yes, they need access to good treatment. They need some resources to be able to do that. And they need a willingness to look some pretty difficult issues in the eye. But if they do that, they can get better.
Quickly, Maria and Annie, we have less than a minute here. Your future now. I mean, are you over this? Are you beyond it? Or is there a chance it'll come back?
You know, the gun's always on the table. I can always pick it up. There's no need to. I had no idea how long it would take, the process. And I had no idea how good it would get without it. I just had no idea how good it would get.
So you're that example of hope and success.
To myself.
Yeah. And well, yeah, that's where it counts the most. And Annie, what about yourself? I know that you say you're still struggling, you're still dealing with it. The future?
I'm still trying. I still think I'm at that point where it's hard for me to picture myself as recovered in the past tense. It's all over now, I'm fine, it's all in the past. And I think that's really hard for me to believe still. I can picture myself being happy enough to not want to really have an eating disorder or to not obsess about it too much, but still kind of semi still this way, maybe a little improved, but it is hard to imagine my life without it. It's been a part of it for so long that it's hard for me to believe in total recoveredness.
Well, I hope you find it.
Thank you.
And I thank you all for taking the time and to share your stories. I really appreciate it. Well, we'd like to thank you for joining us for this KCTS Connect special edition. We invite you to go to the KCTS website at kcts.org, where you'll find streaming video with additional interview clips from the KCTS documentary, Perfect Illusions. You'll also find a list of resources about eating disorders. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you all for being here and sharing your stories and taking the time. I'm Enrique Cerna. Good night.
Local production of KCTS Connects is made possible in part by the members of KCTS and by Seattle Public Utilities, thanking businesses and residents throughout the Puget Sound for their water conservation efforts. Working together, we can solve our regional water resource needs for now and the future. And by the Seattle Post-Intelligencer,